And of course, and the death rate was very, very high with children. Very, very high.
But you did have an awful time in those days, you see, because you got no penicillin, and all you could do was to help them with common sense.
Quite a number of people, they would say, I'd sooner die than face the knife.
People didn't have the doctors very much because they hadn't got the money. When the money was paid for the doctor, there was less for food. My father was a farm labourer, and we lived in a very small cottage, and there were 3 children. My mother went out to work as well, because everything had to be paid, and there was so much money every week. I can see my mother with a shabby purse now, putting the money in, taking it out, whether I should go and get the eggs or not, because if we had the eggs, there wouldn't be the money. And I can see her doing it now, because there was no money in the bank. And when my father wasn't working, there was no insurance. There was only a little money coming in that they paid in every week at one of the pubs. And you went down, it was called the Slate Club, and you went down and collected that, about 12 shillings or something like that. There was nothing else at all. And my mother would not buy things if she couldn't pay for them. We would have to go without. That's why we were brought up on stuffy food that filled, suet dumplings and soups made from a marrowbone and things like that. We were fed well because my mother was very thrifty. She was a very proud little woman, very proud. She wouldn't borrow from the neighbours or let us go into neighbours' houses or anything like that, but she was a very good mother. She kept us clean and tidy and brought us up to be respectable.
We're really a rough lot. There were little gangs of us, you see. And, of course, there was the gang of them that used to be the bum smackers. Now, the middens were, there was, you sat down, there was a kind of a shape of your behind, you know how it was made, the lid of the midden. And underneath it was really a metal pan, you see. And that was what you used to use. Now, 2 streets, the middens come back to back, you see, in the little narrow entry. And, of course, the bum smackers would go down quietly, moving the little, the hinge, the door, away, looking up, see if there was somebody on the midden. And, of course, they might perhaps only find 1 or 2 in about 50 houses each side. But if they caught one, they used to smack the bum, and off they used to go. We were all lousy, every one of us. We all used to have to use a small tooth comb to get the lice out of his head. We used to borrow the tray after one had finished, and we used to put it on your knee and scrape your up with a small tooth comb, and the lice would come out, see, on there. And poor old Dad, I could see him now. When he was doing it, he'd be cracking them all down. We used to kill them all with your thumb. Come out of your head. We were all lousy. And yet we tried to keep clean, see. And as I say, the bugs, well, they were terrible. You could go out in the street and it was a common thing for you to just take one off you and just put your foot on it, you know.
Quite often my father would have a heart attack and we would go in and get the brandy bottle and give him his brandy. But this one particular night my mother was ill also. She was having one of her turns. And so it was very necessary to go down to get the doctor because there were no cars, no bicycles. So with the storm lantern, my sister and I would start out, and to get the doctor, it was about 3 miles we had to walk. We'd go down through these lonely woods, dark woods, no lights. But we were always happy as long as we had our hands to hold. My mother had these attacks where she wanted to do herself in. I think something went wrong with her brain. She was always wanting to. And we sort of knew that, so we were sort of prepared for it. My sister and I would go downstairs at night when she had these turns and hide everything that was sharp. My father's cutthroat razor, because she was always wanting to do herself in.
And my father was a very, very good general practitioner, a most caring one. I was thinking the other day, when I was about, it must have been 8 or 9, I should think, I came home from school, and there was a strange child dressed in my muslin summer frock, best Sunday frock. And I thought, what's all this? And the poor kid's mother had died of an overdose of cocaine in a back street. And you saw those back streets were only one room and a gas stove on the landing. And Father wasn't going to leave the poor little kid there alone with a dead mother. And so he brought her to our house, and we had her certainly until the funeral. I suppose the relieving officer then would have taken over. There wouldn't have been social services like there are now. There would have been an almoner if she'd been a hospital patient, but if she wasn't, you see, there was no one to take it on.
Well, if you got sick, well, we used to lie on the sofa and perhaps have some lemonade. And we used to think it used to help us to get better. We used to lie off and work it off. Of course, as I say, if you got too sick, well, you could go to the doctor, but you had no money to pay him. And then there was the home dispensary on Stretford Road. You could get a bottle of medicine and perhaps a little bit of treatment there. But you see, you didn't get anything for nothing. Anything, you had to pay for everything. There was no social services to help you out of it, no health service or anything like that.
People made up their own mixtures and medicines. And if you were ill and went to the doctor, he just made a mixture in a bottle which you drank. But in the house, when we had a cold, my mother would bake something. It was called a wurzel, and it was a vegetable that was given to the animals like a Swede turnip, and that was cut up and brown sugar put on it, and it was baked in the oven, and the juice of that you had. And also there was a very drastic remedy that they had when you had a very bad cold. They had beer, and it was put into a glass. It used to seem to be, I suppose, stout. And they put the poker in the fire and got it hot, and then they made that hot. and they put ginger in that, and you drank that. We thought it was a marvellous treat. We didn't like it very much, but we thought it was a marvellous treat. And also, every Friday night, every child was given a dose of medicine of some description, licorice powder or Epsom salt. It was the thing that every child had to have that on a Friday, because you weren't going to school on the next day or Sunday school. It wasn't drastic. It was just the thing to keep you clean for the week.
If you went out to work, your family had to try and keep you somewhere or other. Well, if you couldn't be kept, you were kept on parish relief. Well, the parish relief meant that the relieving officer used to come round and he'd give you so much for your rent and so much for your food, you see. It might be only about 15 shillings, you see. Well, the rent of our house was 7 shillings, you see. Well, he might have given 7 shillings, really, to go for food, perhaps keep all the lot to be on. It was a struggle, and, of course, the two main people that you'd go to would be Seymour Meads or the Maypole Dairy, you see, to that way. And then every so often, they used to stop that and send you, put you in the workhouse. They'd keep you, but they'd put the husband in the workhouse more or less deliberately, really, to penalise him if he couldn't get work. They used to send him in there for about 6 weeks. That was the only thing that existed, you see, if you were destitute. Nobody was allowed to wander about at night over 12 o'clock. You were liable to be questioned by the police. What was you doing out at that time? And if you had no home, and you hadn't got, I think it was 1 and 6 in your pocket, you could be arrested as a vagrant and a vagabond, wandering without means of existence. That was the law them days. So really speaking, they had a very, very tight grip on you. I was in the mechanical transport in France, you see. I had been transferred out of an infantry regiment, the East Surreys, in 1917, and taught tractor driving. And I was taught on the old Fulton steam wagons, but eventually we went out as a tractor driver. And, of course, we was heavy haulage out there. And, of course, as I say, when the armistice, I was only out there about 8 months in France. And when the armistice come, that Spanish flu struck. And the following day I was took to hospital, stricken with that Spanish flu. I don't remember how happy the people were with the armistice. I was, day after armistice, I was at death's door, and I don't remember. It was a killer cure within 3 days, very often. 3 days you were dead and buried within a week with that Spanish flu, and it wiped, well, they say it wiped more than what we lost in the war. And it was all youngsters that was stricken with the Spanish flu.
Always, I think, I wanted to be a doctor when I was 8 or 12, that sort of age. And that was before the war, you see, and Father said it was too hard a training for doctors because there were so few women doctors. And then, as I say, I did classics instead. And then, because of the war, and Father saw what women did in the war, he said if I really wanted to do medicine, I could change over. And so I did. My father had got a locum. He'd had one for about 2 or 3 years, but he was a Scotsman, and he wasn't the sort of hard-working Scot that he should have been. He was one of these real Celts who spent half the evening out with his friends playing the violin. And then Father would have to wake him up with a sponge to get him out in the night. And that's what you wanted him for, to helping with night work. But he was much too artistic and really wasn't at all what we wanted. And he would spend half the evening surgery with one patient. You see, when there are 30 sitting in the waiting room, you have to do the rest if somebody takes so long over one. But you see, we worked in those days. We had a surgery from 10 till 11:30 every morning, and another one from 7 to 9 every night, every day of the week, Saturdays as well, and 2 surgeries on Sunday. I was parish doctor, which meant that if anybody hadn't got a doctor of their own, I had to go. Even if she was a princess and she hadn't got the doctor, I had to go, or else if she was a derelict. And I went into a basement one day, and there was this poor woman lying in the middle of a large bed, and there were bits of, I suppose it was, might have been horsehair, I don't know, on the floor, all around everywhere, where the mice had been in to deal with them. And I had to bend over this poor woman and see what was the matter with her. And I had to send her into hospital. And I sent her bed away to be stoved. And they said, "Do you want the bed back?" I said, "It'll walk back." It's absolutely verminous, the whole thing was. Mice and what have you. It was all on the floor in little bits. Terrible the way they lived.
Well, in Rotherham, of course, I had an appointment with the Poor Law Authority. And the result is I had to look after the lower third of humanity, you might say. And that was the thing that got me down quite a lot. Rickets was very common, particularly in the big cities. Glasgow particularly was full of rickets. Now, there were varying degrees of it, but the typical rickety person had a head like a philosopher, a chest like a whippet, a belly like a poisoned pup, and legs like a grand piano. That was the description of the ultimate in rickets. But of course, we know no rickets any longer because of the sun, and the people don't live in these terrible tenements that they used to live in. They never saw the light of day.
Where they was doing pitching, they got the sets up. They always used to fill them in with the pitch, you see. And of course, and when they were boiling pitch, it was always ideal that if your child got whooping cough, you should take them round there. Smell of the vapour from the pitch, or even the gasworks. Seemed as though there were 2 things they used to like to use, you see. But scarlet fever and diphtheria and all that were common. There was always the yellow van coming down from Monsell Fever Hospital, carting them away.
My brother died when he was 3 months old with whooping cough. I can remember the little white coffin being up on the chest of drawers, and I think he used to sleep in a drawer because we hadn't got a cot for him. And then my other sister, she died of diphtheria at 4 years old, and I was in hospital with her at the same time. And that was the only time in my life that I could remember sitting on my mother's knee, having those 3 injections. And then I don't remember very much about it. I suppose I was too ill. And then I woke up and sort of found my sister in the cot, so I was very pleased about that. And I was very pleased until one night there was a lot of commotion going on, and my little sister's cot was covered round with screens, and the doctors and nurses were coming. And then in the morning when I woke up, she wasn't there. So I asked where my sister was, and they said she had gone to Jesus, and that quite soon I would see her again when I went to Jesus, and I had the same thought that I was going to die, because I knew what that meant.
I liked kids and they liked me. I used to have great fun with them, you know. I used to always go in, whether I had a patient in the kids' ward or not, when I was doing my turn at the hospital, I used to always go in the kids' ward and have a joke with them. It was only when they were ill that it got me. A woman came into the surgery one day with a little girl in a blanket. And when I pulled the blanket apart, there was poor little mite, desperately ill. She was breathing very rapidly, and I had an idea what was wrong. As I tried to look in the child's mouth, and when I looked, I was absolutely appalled, because the whole of the back of the throat and the palate as well was full of an exudate, a dirty greyish-white exudate, just like a membrane strung across the whole of the back of the throat. And the smell, which was characteristic of diphtheria, clinched the whole thing. Now, this poor little child was more or less an extremist. She was so ill, she couldn't cry. And I had to send her to the fever hospital, and the poor little mite died the same afternoon.
When I was away working, the lady came to tell me that my mother had gone away and she was in hospital. But the uncle who put her in, that was her brother, said to her, well, she was found down by the river. She was going to put herself in the river. And my uncle said, oh, well, you've had 3 attempts and now you go there and you stop there, which she did for nearly 50 years all but 10 months. And so I myself am a child of 14. I was going up and down, up and down. I think the dread part is seeing all the things that happen, seeing people being put into straitjackets. It made me feel that perhaps that's what would happen to me one day.
I'm not equipped for treating with those sort of people. I just am not. I like proper medicine, you know, things that I can see and handle and listen to and cope with. And I can't help thinking that people ought to be able to control themselves. I know they can't. My mind tells me they can't. But I still somehow feel that They ought to. They're poor things, if you know what I mean. Now, my brother, you see, is the other way on. He was a psychiatrist, and he dealt with all those sort of people. But I found it very difficult. I had to cope with them, of course. We had one who... his family shut him in because he was acute religious mania. And they shut him in, and he broke the window with a broom and got out and went round to the church, and I was sent for in a hurry. And I went round to the church, and every time I appeared in front of the church, he ran round the back. And I went to the rectory, which was next door, and the rector and I chased him round the church, and every time we'd gone round one bit of the church, he'd gone round the next one. And in the end, he was found praying outside the front door, and we had to go and get the ambulance and all the rest and keep him quiet. But it takes years off your life if you have a case like that. And the same afternoon, I was taking a cousin into Bethnal Hospital, and she kept saying, "Give me a tablet and let me die." And I had to take her that same afternoon to Croydon in my car, having had this morning doing this, you see. And that is most terribly exhausting.
Oh, there was a lot of poor souls mentioned. Prestwich was the place they sent him to. Prestwich Asylum. Prestwich Asylum. Oh, anybody that was mentally deranged, there was no trouble. Prestwich Asylum. And that's where they went, and they never come out again. Without somebody sponsored to bring them out. They never come out again. And it was the easiest thing in the world to get anybody put away. You'd only need 2 doctors. If there was anybody really that was got a lot of money and that, you know, and they thought we were being a bit eccentric, so they could get 2 doctors to certify. That was the end of that person. They were put away.
When I had measles and was taken into a hospital, and I was put into a children's ward because there was nowhere to put an adult with measles. And when I woke up after I'd been there for a few days, I knew there was confusion going on and things were going on. But when I woke up at night, I saw all these cots, and I saw white figures coming down, like the Gluglax Glen. But afterwards I understood, because the people who came to visit their children in the measles hospital had these white gowns on. So I thought, at last, they had really put me in a mental hospital now. I thought that really happened. I don't think any mother would want a nanny to look after a baby who'd got a mother in a mental hospital. You just kept that thing quiet. One day I was in the airing cupboard. There'd been a disturbance in the nursery, and the housekeeper and the lady were talking outside of the airing cupboard, and I was in the airing cupboard, and I heard the discussion, and I heard the housekeeper say, "Oh, well, she'll end up where her mother is." And that was one of my nightmares when my mother went. My mother had got out, and I felt that they were putting me in. And the nightmares, one of those nightmares of the airing cupboard came into it. Only the airing cupboard was shut, the door was shut, and the room got warmer and warmer. But I'd got into the bed, and I couldn't get out of the bedclothes. Those sort of nightmares were happening all that time, and all the sleepwalking, until I went to my doctor, and we talked for weeks and weeks. And he said, "No," he said, "you'll never have another nightmare, and you'll never sleepwalk again," and I never have.
When you're living in an area like I was living in, a poor area, there was no beauty in the back streets of Kennington at all. And when I was a student at Oxford, you see, I got into the Oxford Bark Choir. I'd always sung at school in all the school choirs, and I wouldn't miss a choir practice for anything if I could help it. We didn't sing all through the war, but we did sing the Matthew Passion every Palm Sunday and Passion Sunday for years until the war. And then in the war, we did it one year on practically no rehearsals. And I used to say to God, now, for goodness sake, just let me sing the Matthew Passion, then you can bomb me the next day if you like. And, of course, there was a bomb in Hyde Park about the day before. And when we scream Barabbas, as you do, you say, Barabbas, just like that. Down came the bits and pieces off the roof. Then they had to have wire netting across the top of the Albert Hall to stop it. But it was marvellous to be able to go and just sing that in the war, as though the war wasn't there. You know, it took you right out of the war and all the things you'd seen and done. And then, you see, there was the tube next door to my house, and everybody rushed down there as soon as the warning came. So you went down 82 circular stairs like that. And I had to go a visit every night to do an evening surgery, as it were, for people who couldn't get to their own doctors, because, of course, the siren very often went at 4:30 or 5 as soon as it got dark. So I had to go down and walk around the platforms and just, appear not to mind. And they say, what's it like on top, you see? And I say, oh, not bad, when you just heard a huge bump and you wondered if it was your house or not. They had double bunks up against the wall. Everybody brought their own blankets and pillows and things, and they lay to within 1.5 feet, I should think, of the edge of the platform. Just room for you to get out of the train. But of course the trains all stopped the minute there was a warning, because they couldn't go under the Thames. A great steel shutter came down at Waterloo and at London Bridge, so as to stop the water coming through the tunnel if they bombed the river.
Hello, shovellers. In 1 more minute, the lights will be dimmed. Now hurry along and get to bed, tuck yourself up well. Good night, everybody.
Then, you see, I had to crawl about in the ruins. And you see, you can't be in a white surgeon's gown with a sterile syringe. You can't have methylated spirit and disinfect the area that you're going to inject. You're faced with perhaps just a black stocking, and the rest of the patient isn't visible at all. And all you want to know is whether they're alive or whether they're dead, and you can't tell if you've just got a leg like that in a black stocking. So you injected it straight through the black stocking and hoped they were dead anyway, and if they weren't, you gave them a great dose of morphia, which would help them out. But I had a lot of that sort of thing to do, and I stood about in streets, stood while the heavy rescues, they were called, tried to get people out. I knew I had a job to do, and I'm one of those who, if I see a job to do, I don't see anything else. You know what I mean? If I was told to go and somebody would say, mind that bomb hole, well, I wouldn't have seen it, because if I want to go anywhere, I go, and I look straight ahead, if you know what I mean. I'm still like it.
I felt very much better when the war came and they turned it into the Oakwood Hospital. And also when there weren't so many locked doors. And then my mother was in a ward that we only had to go through one locked door. And then suddenly I had a letter to say that I could have my mother out. All I had to do was to get a taxi and go and have her out. But of course I've realised that she didn't want to come, and it wouldn't have done. But I was free, because you see she was certified, and when they're certified you can't get them out. She was certified to be in there, but afterwards she wasn't. She was in there voluntary, And even that made a difference to me, to know that she was in there voluntary and that she could come out any time she wanted to.
We lived in a poverty age. We suffered in silence in a way. Of course, Mark, you had to suffer in silence because straight away there was a police on horseback with big buttons, you know. And he would only need the Lord Mayor to read the Riot Act outside Albert Square, and he could come and charge on you, and knock hell out of you, you know, if you got disturbing. But we submitted, you see. They sent him to the workhouse. He just accepted it. We didn't do violence. They had the unemployment meetings, but it was always quelled. We just grinned and bared it.
I always knew in my mind I wanted a home of my own, and I would have my own house, and that's why I collected my bottom drawer. I never thought about a husband or a boyfriend. That didn't interest me at all. And when I had my boyfriends, I never let it get serious because of my mother, because I'd have to tell them. But my sister didn't mind. Her boyfriend knew from the word go, but I never did. And so I always kept things sort of kept them at bay sort of thing. My mother, when she died, I felt relieved, and yet it was a great loss. Such a loss that I had great difficulty in not getting myself to go visiting other patients up there. I knew I mustn't, but it was something that I felt I must go and do. I did stop myself, but I missed it very, very much. But it was such a great relief because I used to go up and down and think, oh, is this ever going to ever end? And I can remember children at school saying about suicide, and I asked my mother and father what suicide the word meant, because I was very fond of large words. And, of course, I was just shut up. You weren't allowed to know. But it always puzzled me. And it was only as I got older that I sort of realised all these things. And that is the thing that's worried me all my life. You had to keep quiet about it. You never talked. You never talked about that sort of thing.